And this is in dollars then, not dollars in 2014. $20 million had been given for relief efforts. There were about 200 American orphanages that had been created to feed, to educate, to care, to try to bring orphans and those who had survived, but particularly orphans, back to some sense of normality. Between 1916 and 1929, there were nearly 1,000 Americans who served in some way in relief efforts. And actually quite a number of those who attempted to intervene actually ended up passing away through natural causes, but through disease or accidents of different sorts in that attempt to deal with the starving Armenians. Myriads in these orphanages became surrogate mothers. There was an attempt to restore a sense of nationalism by singing Armenian songs, to help these orphans to find faith through Christianity, but faith in the world. Now, just to briefly say something about what we've experienced in a similar way in an organization now that we've spent a lot of time in, Solace Ministries. They also have very much tried to be engaged in a healing process. And there are specific things that they have been doing which have been extremely effective. For example, every Wednesday, and they do this all over the country, they have small groups, sometimes actually large groups of 100 or so, who meet together to simply tell their story of what happened in the genocide. There's something enormously healing about, rather than keeping that story capped and submerged, to instead to let it come out, for a narrative to somehow surround it as part of a healing process. Also, in a number of cases, they've attempted to intervene by assisting people with housing. Lorna mentioned that in Naftal's case, houses were destroyed. To assist people with their education, to help them to be self-sufficient, and most fundamentally, to help them to experience their humanity by creating a new family for orphans and widows who lost their parents and lost their children. Now, I want to say something that's very touching to me. On April 24th, tomorrow, although their clock is about 12 hours ahead of ours, at Solace Ministries, they will be commemorating the Armenian genocide. They've chosen that date as a way to also commemorate their own genocide. But I think there is something extremely important about the way that they're reaching beyond themselves, commemorating the first genocide of the 20th century as they commemorate their own.
I want to add one more thing about the importance of the orphanages and what happened in orphanages and what happens in Solace Ministries. The orphanages, as Don said, were mostly run by missionaries, Christian missionaries, and one of the things that maybe Don did mention is that giving them hope, telling them about God as their Father. You know, many children, psychologists would tell you, when their parents die, they feel abandoned. They think their parents abandoned them. But the missionaries had to, taught these kids that while your parents die, there is God, your Father, who gives you hope, who will keep you going. And that was extremely important for the orphanages, as I know from my father's story. That same message is also true in Soulless Ministry. It's a faith-based organization. And what those people, they feel so minimized. They feel like they're worthless. So many of the women were raped, and they feel like their life is worth nothing when they come to Soulless. But Soulless teaches them that God sees no difference among people. And as far as God is concerned, they are of value, that they are created in God's image just like everyone else. And it's that Christian message, that hope that comes from a belief in God and an experience of God, that has kept so many of the Armenian survivors, as well as the Rwandan survivors, going. I just think that's a really important point to make. One thing that has been very difficult, something we've learned from the two genocides, post-genocide, meaning after genocide, specifically for survivors, is that the lack of closure. And that comes from not knowing where your loved ones were killed, where their bodies lay, and not being able to give them a dignified burial. This was certainly my father's sorrow, never being able to know where his mother, his brother, his sisters were, and not to be able to bury them. The only one he could bury was Sirun, and she represented his whole past. And so the way my father dealt with that all his life, and in fact all the survivors, because they couldn't have that dignified burial of their loved ones, was that towards the end of their lives, what we found is that they were more preoccupied with the genocide than they were earlier. Part of that is because early they were simply trying to survive, get food and shelter and so forth, raise their own families, which in fact became a source of reconciliation for them. Their healing began when they started new families. But the fact that there was the denial, the lack of acknowledgement from other countries, almost always put in doubt, why are we not recognized, really was rather painful for them. And the final way my father dealt with that was writing his own story. And in his story, he writes to each one of his siblings and his mother, imagining what those last few minutes before they died felt like, and giving them comfort, saying, Mama, brother, Popcan, and so forth, you are now in a place where there's no longer any crying, any weeping, but you're in the hands of our Lord. And he quotes verses to comfort each of them, which he couldn't do when he was away from them. We've seen the same thing in Rwanda. Not knowing where their loved ones' bodies lay has become of utmost importance to them. And one thing that's really helped many of the survivors is Don just alluded to it. In the country, for the last 10 years, they started what they call the gacaca courts, since the whole legal system in the country was completely decimated. And this is a traditional thing that they've done for centuries. All over the countries, they set up courts in neighborhoods, in communities, where they actually selected and trained judges. And as the prisoners came, they were given a chance to confess what they did, who they killed, how they killed, and where the bodies lay. And while this was somewhat traumatic for the survivors, it was a form of justice, truth-telling. But every single one of them told us, we learned where the bodies of our loved ones were. They went, exhumed these bones, they washed them, put them in coffins, and were able to bury. And that was part of the healing for them. And the most recent case was our Naftali. He went, and unfortunately we weren't feeling well, we couldn't go with him, to his hometown, because he had found his father's and grandfather's bones, and he did a proper burial in a burial site.
Now, Lorna's going to close with some comments in just a moment, but I want to say something about a very important memorial site in the capital city of Rwanda, Kigali. It's a beautiful memorial. Actually, about 250,000 bodies have been exhumed and then reburied at this memorial in the sort of ceremonial way that Lorna just alluded to that has helped to give healing to them. But in that genocide memorial, there is a wall on the Armenian genocide. that tells the story of the 1.5 million Armenians who were killed in 1915, 1916. And unfortunately, for the last few years, the Republic of Turkey has been lobbying the Rwandan government to remove that wall commemorating the Armenian genocide, saying that it has no role. This is simply a genocide memorial for their own individuals who were lost. So I think at the same time that we want to look forward to the future, it's also clearly important to look to the past. And there's a sense in which denial literally kills the dead a second time. And so I think tomorrow on April 24th at USC, we will be at noon doing a commemoration for the 99th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. Lorna will be attending a similar commemoration, and I assume many of you will be doing that here in Pasadena. And all over the country and the world, similar commemorations will be occurring.
You know, April is really a very sad month in many ways. I don't know how many of you realize, in addition to the Armenian genocide and the Rwandan genocide that are commemorated in April, so is the Holocaust and the Cambodian genocide. 4 different genocides. They date April as the start of their genocides. Interestingly, Good Friday often falls in April also, where our Lord was crucified. However, there's a different way to look at April also. As much as it's Good Friday, it's also the Resurrection Month. Christos Hagia Imeranot, right? In April, usually in April. So it's for resurrection. The resurrection of our Lord is also indicates new life, a new beginning. And that's what I have to say about the genocides. Thinking of our own people, the Armenians, they struggled tremendously, particularly the first half of their lives. But I have to say, at least those who came to this country, the second half of their lives, they did pretty well. You know, they made it. They had homes, they had children, they had grandchildren. And wherever Armenians ended up, in the diaspora, as a people, really, we have done quite well. Our children have excelled, our grandchildren are doing even better. We have been in every aspect of society, as leaders, as businessmen, as professors, as religious leaders. So I think we need to celebrate that as a people, not only mourn the genocide, but be grateful that as a people we have done as well as we have. We have become victors in many ways. I don't care if they deny. We will continue to do our best to let the world know what happened. We will never deny ourselves. We will work on Turkey. But at the same time, I want us to rejoice at how well we have done. My father lost 7 of it, you know, a family of 9. So he had 7 children to replace all his family. That meant 13 grandchildren today, 25 great-grandchildren. You know, he became a very successful pastor, wonderful man, dedicated his life to the spiritual well-being of others, but he also loved serving people. And I don't know how many of you remember, many of you might have become citizens because my father taught you all about citizenship and went to the courts as a witness. So his ministry was very broad, socially, materially, and spiritually. Also, as much as he wanted to go to the university, he couldn't, but the 7 of us did. Our grandchildren are doing even better, very high degrees, lawyers, doctors, you know, so forth. So again, let's rejoice. But what does that say about our responsibility as survivors, as children of survivors, as grandchildren of survivors? I'll just be very personal. What has really helped me heal as the child of a survivor with secondary trauma, which we have realized, is first working on the book on the Armenian survivors, giving a voice to the voiceless, then returning to the Republic of Armenia to see how we can be helpful. And most recently, what has been the most powerful experience for me has been in Rwanda. And, you know, I am so grateful for the people who intervened in the lives of our parents and grandparents, the missionaries, the hundreds and thousands of people who poured money in and helped in so many ways. And I felt like my way of repaying them is to be in Rwanda, to help the people there, to stand in solidarity, say that I know what you're going through because my parents went through it, to listen to their stories, to give them hope as much as they have helped me understand what our folks went to. It's for us to give them hope, to say, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you are going to be doing better. God is not going to abandon you. He will be with you. And so, you know, in whatever way we have been able to help, we've tried to help. In the case of Naftal, let me end the story well. Naftal, now 20 years later, got married, has 3 beautiful children, and his first daughter was born when we were in Rwanda, and we were the first ones to go and meet this little baby. And they named her RP. That's the name of our daughter. But even more important is the meaning of RP. In literature, RP is are the early morning sun rays. And Naftal says, the birth of this child and then my other children has brought sunshine into my life. He is now, he's graduated from university, and he has a very important position in a survivor organization. It's an umbrella organization over all the survivors. And he has dedicated his life to helping other survivors. So I say these things because God calls us in mysterious ways. I would have never imagined that we would end up in Rwanda. And I know my father is just rejoicing in heaven that that's what Dana and I have ended up doing. And I think each of us as Armenians with the tragedies that we have overcome, we have to listen to that voice of God, because there is help needed in Armenia, in Syria, in so many places with Armenians, as well as places around the world. And what is God calling us to as survivors? How can we be of help and a source of hope, if nothing else, to others?